Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. If you guys can hear me, please let me know in the chat box. You can. Okay, awesome. Okay, let's go ahead, inshallah, and get started. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. So let me just start off by welcoming all of you here for today's webinar, inshallah. And as you know, what we're going to be talking about today is why does God allow suffering? A comparative look at Christianity's and Islam's uh, uh, answers to that very question. Now, before I get into the topic, you may have noticed that this topic is very, very similar to a topic that Ustad Hamza covered maybe 2 sessions ago, 3 sessions ago about the problem of evil. So that being said, what we're going to be looking at in this particular session is specifically the comparison between Christianity and Islam, in the sense that what are some of the things that Christianity offers as an answer to this question, and how does that compare to what Islam offers? Now, I'm going to try my best not to repeat the information that was covered in Hamza's webinar. So that being said, if you have not listened to that one, I'm going to highly recommend that you listen to it. It doesn't have to be before this one, but at some point you do want to listen to it, because I'll be making some assumptions which hopefully I'm assuming everyone here will be able to handle. And of course, if not, then we can always look at it at the question and answers. Now, also, I wanted to mention why this topic, like why compare Christianity and Islam. So one of the dynamics about, I guess, being in the US and trying to organize programs is you're, and this is obviously before the coronavirus. When we were doing these programs, we wanted to organize programs that were not in the realm of what you would call a typical interfaith event, right? Because my own opinion with that is that with interfaith events, you have the Muslims that come there and the non-Muslims, whether they be Christians or Jews or Hindus or whatever it might be, and they come and then everyone kind of just agrees on things and then goes home. And so you're good, we're good. And so as a point of dawah, I don't think it's very effective. Maybe it's good in terms of establishing relationships with other groups that we want to work with on campus or in our communities. But as a specific means to call people to Islam, I'm not sure if it's the best vehicle. It has its own purposes, and I'm not negating it altogether. That being said, I also am a bit critical on the straight debates, right? I think they have their value in a certain context, in a certain place, a certain time, and they can be very effective. But I think that efficacy really does depend on where, when, and what culture we are presenting that debate in. So that being said, because I'm critical of both of these, I wanted to find something that was in the middle. So it's not an interfaith event, and it's not a debate where everyone brings their egos and goes home thinking their team won, right? So what we came up with, and this was last year, I believe 2019, was we started doing events with this very topic. Why does God allow suffering? A comparative look at Christianity and Islam's answers. And it may have been titled somewhat different. And we held this event, I think, in 4 or 5 different college campuses around Texas, excuse me, and actually around the U.S., because I'm going to include Arkansas in there as well. And I have to say I have to say first of all that the events were really nice in the fact that it wasn't that everyone left on an agreement, but at the same time, everyone did not leave with a feeling of defeat or a feeling of lowliness, right? Because a lot of the times we do debates and there's this abrasion, there's this roughness to what we're doing. Alhamdulillah, that was something that I was very pleased with. And at the same time, because of what I'm going to be presenting today, hopefully, um, I think Islam kind of clearly stood out as being the truth, right? And so that's kind of the background to why we're looking at this topic specifically from the angle of comparison as opposed to just as a question, right? So like I said, in terms of just answering it as a question, why does God allow suffering? We have a whole webinar that was done on that, but specifically we're looking at this as a comparison because we've had some very good successes in the past, and maybe I'll bring up a few of those as we go through the material. So that's some of the background in terms of why we're covering what we're covering, why this topic in the way that we're covering. So let's go ahead and start with what we're going to be looking at. So with that said, Bismillah. The first thing we want to do is we want to understand that Islam has a certain worldview. In other words, a person that says Islam is true, they have a certain view about the nature of God. Who is Allah? Who is God? What exactly do we mean when we say Allah? They have a certain view when it comes to salvation. In other words, how exactly does one enter paradise and avoid the hellfire? Okay. They have a very clear idea when it comes to the purpose and meaning of life. And they have an idea based on that purpose and meaning of life and based on their sources about the nature of this world and the nature of the afterlife. And so too, a Christian worldview that claims that it is the truth also has a lot to say about each one of these in terms of what is the nature of God, what is salvation, what is it based upon, etc. What is the purpose and meaning of life, and how does one look at this world compared to the afterworld? Okay. Now, all of this from the Islamic point of view and perhaps the Christian point of view, these two worldviews, you may know about them generally. But what we want to do today is we want to look at both of these worldviews and compare them with respect to the problem of evil, right? That is what we're trying to do today and come to some sort of a conclusion that does one worldview offer a solution and an answer that is more palatable to not only our intellectual selves, but our emotional selves as well. All right. And I would extend that and say our spiritual selves as well. Okay, so that's our purpose for today. Now let's get into what we mean by the problem of evil. What is the main claim? So basically, if you're unfamiliar with the problem of evil and how it works and how it is, the claim is that it is unbelievable, and it could also be said as highly unlikely that a good, merciful, loving, and all-powerful, omnipotent being exists with all of the evil and gratuitous suffering in the world. And simply put, someone would say, we see all of this evil, like I have suffered, right? Someone maybe in my family died of cancer, let's say, and may Allah protect all of us and all of our families. But someone said, look, so why would God do that? If God is all loving, right? He is merciful, as the Muslims say. He is Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, Al-Ghafur. He is full of mercy. Okay, so if that's the case, and he is all powerful, there's nothing outside the dominion of God, the power of God, then why would God allow evil to exist? Because if he is all loving, he does not want evil. He does not want suffering for his creation. And if he has power to do something about it, then well, if he's all powerful, then he can do something about it. So then why does evil exist? And of course, this can go back to another, we can say our 17th century Scottish philosopher by the name of David Hume, who says, Epicurus's old questions are yet unanswered. Is he willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he's impotent. If he is able but not willing, then he's malevolent. If he is both able and willing, why then is there evil? Whence then is evil? Okay, just stating kind of what I just stated, except he makes it in your 17th century English. All right. So I think the problem of evil and the problem of suffering is pretty straightforward. What exactly is the issue here? So what we want to look at now is this very issue, this problem, the problem of evil, or you can say the problem of suffering. Where does it come from? Where do these ideas come from? How, where did they originate? And we want to look at it first from the perspective of Christianity. Now, Christianity, without getting into a deep history of the formation of Christianity, where it came from and so on and so forth, there's a couple of things we want to understand. First of all, when one goes through the Bible, that the person, they'll notice that there is a certain nature personality, this quality, attribute, characteristic of God that's in the Old Testament that is not like it is in the New Testament. So, as you may or may not know, the Bible is generally divided into the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? The Jews believe in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, while the Christians take the entire text as whole, right? And of course, there are, and I don't want to get into a discussion on text here, but there are different versions and so on and so forth. Again, the discussion is not about the actual text itself, but the origination of this issue. So one of the things that historians mention is that you have a nature of God in the Old Testament, right? And this nature of God is one that is a God of anger, a God of retribution, a God of punishment, which then, when you come to the New Testament, becomes a God of overwhelming love and forgiveness and so on. Now, early on, one of the when the issue of why does God let evil happen, or what is the purpose of suffering and evil, one of the things that arose was this dualism in somewhat of a superficial sense, in the sense that, like for instance, when you come to the time of Saint Augustine, there's this type of dualism about the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. And really, the God of the Old Testament is where you have the devil and evil, and that is just running rampant. And so that's why the quality of God there is portrayed as with these qualities. Whereas when you get to the time of the New Testament, this evil that's running rampant has been overcome. Okay, and how has it been overcome? It has been overcome because the starting point was evil, in the sense of there was an original sin. That original sin carries on person by person, right? They have the story of Adam and Eve, right? Adam and Eve, they sinned, and therefore that sin is something that's part and parcel of each human being when they're born. And of course, that sin was there and present until God sent Jesus, alayhi salam, and according to what they believe, that he died for the sins of human beings, and therefore sins were removed according to their belief. So evil from that perspective was running rampant until the time of Jesus. And now that Jesus came and took that evil away, there was a type of victory over that evil. And this theory, a theory of what they call a theory of atonement, is called the Christus Victor theory. And there's others that relate to how do you deal with the sin problem. Okay, so the point is that there is a problem of evil that's dealt with in this idea that evil exists and it has to be dealt with. And from a Christian worldview, it is dealt with the sending of Jesus, who dies for the sins of mankind. That is in fact Jesus, who is in fact God, and so on and so forth. And I think we're all familiar with the Trinitarian idea of who Jesus is supposed to be. Okay. Now, this changes somewhat during the time of Saint Augustine. He's writing on this topic, and this type of dualism is negated in one way or another. And by the way, this idea of dualism, I want to clarify what I mean here. This idea of dualism, it's an easy way to understand the presence of evil, in the sense that if you have a God and this God is all loving, then the only reason there's evil is because there is another, let's say, equivalent being, or maybe a little less equivalent, that is evil. And so now you have a dualism that can explain the presence of evil in the world, right? And so, for instance, in the Persian Empire, the people there were Zoroastrians, and they had this idea of a god of light and a god of darkness. And so they have this type of dualism that arises in the Zoroastrian faith. So this type of dualism is an easy and convenient way of explaining the presence of evil. However, there are certain issues with this, right? If you say that there are two gods, then what do you mean by God? And of course, then we get into the very idea of how do you define God and so on and so forth. And someone who holds to a monotheistic, worldview, someone that believes that God is one, cannot prescribe or cannot follow this idea of dualism, or there being two gods, one of good and one of evil. Okay, and again, I'm not going to get too far into that as to the reasons why, because those are covered in other seminars, right? So why is it that God can only be one? Even from a logical point of view, it goes back to how do you define God, his names, his attributes. We'll talk about some of that today in terms of the names and attributes of Allah, how to understand that, what is the appropriate way to understand that. But just understanding that God by necessity has to be one, that's a topic for another webinar where you could get into that, right? Because again, if you have two gods, do they share in power? If they share in power, power is not absolute. And so if one God says it's going to rain, another says it's going to snow, which decision is taken? If it's the God that says it's going to snow, then that's the God that is truly God, because that's the one that has overarching power, and so on and so on and so forth. So there's other theological and philosophical issues that arise when you subscribe to dualism. However, when it comes to the problem of evil, it's an easy way to kind of solve the issue, right? And so this kind of lasts to the time of Saint Augustine. He writes on the topic and then comes back, in a sense, bringing the Christian world back to the idea of a pure monotheism, not a pure monotheism, but a type of monotheism that does away with this dualism. And then you have the idea of the problem of evil itself from the perspective of, if there is one being, then why does this one being allow evil in the world? Okay, so that's kind of from the Christian background. What is the origin of this issue in the Islamic background, in the Islamic world? Well, one of the things we have to understand is when we look at uh, the origination of the Islamic worldview, you can say, we find that it is deeply rooted in the first three generations of Islam. And this comes from narrations that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, where the Prophet ﷺ said, خَيْرُ النَّاسِ قَرْنِي ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ ثُمَّ الَّذِينَ يَلُونَهُمْ. The best of people are my generation, then the one after that, then the one after that. So what we find by and large is that this issue about the problem of evil, it wasn't something that was really a problem amongst those first two, or let's say three generations of the Muslims. And of course, this has a lot to do with the idea of understanding the problem from the text, from the Quran and from the Sunnah, which we'll get into in a little bit, as to why the fact that a person that that adopts the Quran Sunnah as their worldview, why this isn't really that much of it isn't a problem at all. Because when we get into the idea of existential questions, why do you exist? What's our purpose? These things are clarified very quickly. And so there's really no need to resort to some sort of a logical or intellectual or even emotional problem sometimes, because of the source text of Islam. That being said, you find that this issue enters into the Islamic world most likely at the hands of a group called the Mu'tazila, right? The Mu'tazilites, as they are known in English. So what are the Mu'tazila trying to do? Well, they're trying to bridge this gap between the Quran and Greek philosophy, right? And so because of that, the idea of the problem of evil does become a problem. Now, there's a lot of theories as to how did the Mu'tazila, originate. Where did they come from? Where did they get their ideas from, etc. One of the ideas that the Mu'tazila were known for is the idea of being extreme rationalists, in the sense that, well, from one perspective, when we look at the Quran, we try to use our minds to understand the Quran. Okay. However, we don't use our minds to undermine the Quran. This is a difference that we have in terms of methodology. Once you start using the mind to basically be a judge over the Quran itself, this becomes a bit of a problem. Now, the Mu'tazila, they fell into this. Like I said, there's a few theories as to why. One of those theories, and I'll just mention just for your own reference, one of the theories suggests that that they had, because the Muslim world expanded into the Persian Empire. And remember, we said the Persians were dualists in the idea of they believed in a god of a god of light and a god of darkness and so on. Because they were exposed to that and their philosophies and their writings, now they were bringing that into the Islamic framework and saying, how do we reconcile evil uh, from the perspective of God being one? So this is one theory. Another theory stipulates, and it may be a combination of both of these. Another theory stipulates that it's actually when the Islamic empire expanded towards the Byzantium Empire, and when there was more connection and interaction with some of the Christians of those areas. One of the initial, you can say, shubuhat, or one of the initial problems, or whatever you want to call it, was the idea on the nature of Isa alayhi salam, the nature of Jesus. Okay, so one of the claims that the Christians brought had to do with the Quran. They said, "Do you believe that the Quran is kalamullah, that it is the speech of God?" And so the Muslim would say, "Well, yeah, of course. Is the speech of God created or uncreated?" Well, now the general stance, as we all know, hopefully know, is that the speech of Allah is uncreated. It's attributes of Allah. They say, okay, if that's the case, was Isa alayhi salam created or uncreated? They say, well, Isa alayhi salam was created, but wasn't Isa alayhi salam also the word of God? So if he's the word of God and the Quran is the word of God, you're saying one is created and one is uncreated? All right, so now the Mu'tazila then took the position that indeed the Quran in fact is created. And there were some debates back and forth about how exactly, like why they took this position and so on and so forth. But another theory that kind of stipulates why the Mu'tazila, came about had to do with this idea of understanding the nature of Isa alayhi salam. Okay, now this very question, if it's a question that you have, how exactly you reconcile that, understand that there's the idea of linguistics. How exactly, what do we mean when we say kalamullah versus that Isa alayhi salam is a word from him? How is that understood? And what are the differences? There's certain grammatical differences that have to be highlighted. So it's not really that big of a problem. It's just that initially when you're exposed to it, it may cause you to rattle to some extent, right? But again, and maybe we can do another session on specifically this issue. I don't want to kind of go away from our topic, but just understanding this idea of the Mu'tazila and them bringing in the issue of the problem of evil and their sources could be either coming from the Byzantium Empire or the Persian Empire when Islam expands, right? So remember I said Islam's, the Prophet ﷺ says that the best of generations, my generation, then the one after that, then the one after that. But understand from a historical context, it's the spreading of Islam where they're interacting with people that you find some of this dilution as well, okay? So, uh, so again, one of the reasons why it doesn't become a huge problem for the majority of, let's say, Sunni Muslims, or the Muslims of Ahl Sunnah, is because of the source texts and their clarity on this issue. Okay, and if you heard Hamza's session, Ustad Hamza's session, he probably took you through the story of Musa and Khidr, right? Which is a very, it's a story that clarifies the issue, along with other ayat and hadith that can do that, inshallah. But anyhow, and then of course there's another concept related to the nature of God, which we'll get into in a few minutes, right? Understanding who Allah is. Once a person understands that, then this really doesn't become an issue. All right. Okay. So now let's look at some of the categorizations. When we say the problem of evil, it's not just kind of one sort of issue, right? There is what you might call the intellectual problem of evil, and the versus the emotional problem of evil. Okay, now there's an intellectual problem, which is, as I had stated, that if God is all good, all merciful, all loving, and he's all powerful, then why does evil exist, right? And if that's the case, then God doesn't exist. Now right off the bat, it doesn't logically follow. And if you heard Ustad Hamza's session on this, it doesn't follow, because there could be very good reasons as to why God allows evil to happen, or why God permits suffering to happen, right? Just because you don't know the answers doesn't make it a logical quagmire, doesn't make it a logical problem. So from that perspective, what we're seeing is that when someone presents it as a logical problem, or let's say an intellectual problem, it really doesn't connect unless you make some assumptions. And we'll get into some of those assumptions, but one of those assumptions is that God is only all loving and only all powerful. And another third assumption you might take is that he's only all knowing. Okay, and all of these are absolute, so they're all powerful, all loving, all knowing. From the Islamic framework, this is just an abstraction. In other words, you've taken three of the names and attributes of Allah and use them to come up with a logical problem. When one of the names of Allah is that He is Al-Hakim, He is the wise, and there is a wisdom behind these things. Just because we don't know it doesn't necessitate that there's no reason for the evil to be, or that God doesn't exist. Okay, so that's the intellect. When we talk about the intellectual problem, that's the intellectual problem. How do we now solve this logical issue from this perspective? But then there's a more difficult problem, and that problem has to do with the idea of emotion and human emotion. So um, so in the sense that we're not logical robots. And when a calamity happens, or when something evil happens, when we see people suffering, whether it be someone, whether it's ourselves, whether it's people from some other part of the world, whatever it might be, this has an impact on us as human beings. And for very good reason, because it shows that we are emotive beings that care about, obviously if it's ourselves and we care about ourselves, but even more than that, we care about human suffering in general. Now, this emotional problem is much different than the intellectual problem, because this has to do with the connection of the heart and the human emotive state with the idea of suffering. Okay, and so what I'm proposing in this particular discussion is that both from an intellectual problem of evil point of view and an emotional problem of evil point of view, uh, in both of these camps, Islam what Islam offers is far superior based on the fact that it is the truth than what Christianity offers. Okay? Now, when we look at the intellectual problem of evil, we're going to further divide that into what's known as what we can say is the logical form versus the evidential form. Excuse me. So the logical form versus the evidential form. The logical form is just the kind of the logical uh, kind of equation or whatever you want to call it that I set up earlier, right? And before I do that, the evidential form doesn't say that, okay, it's logically impossible for God to exist and evil to exist. What it says is because of the sheer amount, quantity, and quality of evil that's out there, it is unlikely that God exists, right? So from just looking at the sheer amount, the sheer intensity, right? That you have earthquakes that happen, and let's say thousands and thousands and thousands of people die, and so that's a large number of people that suffer. Not only that, but you have buildings that are falling upon someone, so it's a horrible death in the quality, right? In the qualitative nature of that evil is extremely bad as well. So when they look at it, they don't say we're saying it's logically impossible. What we're saying is highly unlikely. So I'm going to start with the logical aspect of this problem. And what we're going to be looking at, we'll look at what we mean by the logical problem, and hopefully that's clarified up to this point. And then we'll look at what is the Christian solution to this logical problem, right? As for the Islamic solution, I briefly touched upon it. If you want more details on that, like I mentioned, you can check out Ustad Hamza's webinar on this. Okay, logical problem of evil. All right. So first of all, understanding that all sorts of evil exists. All right. Now that's something that we observe through our own experience, through our own, the world around us, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of taken. All right. The qualities of God. All right. So if God is omniscient, He's all knowing, and He's omnipotent, He's almighty and all powerful, and He's omnibenevolent and all loving, then how can we say God exists? Like what? Like or either evil should exist or God should exist. All right. So if He's all knowing, then He knows about evil existing. Now let me just mention something here real quick. So one of the first places we did this dialogue. Remember when I started this session, I was talking about how we have a Christian speaker and myself, and we dialogued about this topic. One of the things that I presented, I said, look, this is the logical problem of evil, and one solution might be to just give up one of these attributes. So if, because you could just say, well, in order to solve this issue, God doesn't know everything. Na'udhu billah, right? So in one of the sessions we did, it actually ended up that the person that I was speaking with, my interlocutor, the one that I was dialoguing with, actually said that. And what was really interesting is that he had invited his whole church to come to the dialogue, and his family, his wife and kids. And when he said that, he said, I'm not sure if God knows everything. He might not know the future, right? Because he was really stuck in this issue. And you heard this gasp from the audience. It was just like, oh, I mean, and I kind of gasped. I was like, what? Really? He goes, yeah. He goes, it might not be a popular opinion, but that's kind of what I'm sticking to, because we have all these environmental issues, and that's all the hands of man, and God just, God doesn't know the future, and so on and so forth, right? But anyhow, so my point is, when it comes to the idea of God being all-knowing, by and large, with this exception that I'm mentioning, by and large, people would agree that this is an attribute of God that cannot be sacrificed. Okay, because this leads to other issues. If God is not all-knowing, then why would you worship Him? Why would you submit unto Allah? What is the point of calling out to God in your times of distress and need if he doesn't even know, if his knowledge is limited in some way? Okay. Now the next one, so one of the solutions you give up on one of these attributes. So what exactly is the Christian response to this logical problem, this logical setup of the problem of evil? Okay. So one thing before I get to the Christian response is we need to understand how they approach the problem. All right. So Alvin Plantinga is a Christian philosopher, and he's very popular. And he makes a dichotomy. In other words, he's now presenting kind of how to support the Christian claim that just because evil exists doesn't mean God does not exist, right? And he breaks down his claim, or his idea, into two categories, you can say. So one is what he calls a theodicy. Now typically a theodicy is understood as to giving an account of why God lets evils happen. And so all of this that we're talking about may be considered a theodicy from that perspective. But Alvin Plantinga divides it up. He says, look, there's a theodicy, and what a theodicy does, it tells us that, okay, we understand there's evil, and then it gives us reasons as to why those evils exist in the world, right? So it's more of like understanding in a sense, the wisdom of God in allowing those evils, right? So if you remember from the Islamic framework, we understand that God, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's a certain wisdom behind allowing some of those evils and suffering, right? So from Alvin Plantinga's dichotomy here, that would be considered a theodicy, trying to now understand what are some of those wisdoms. However, what Alvin Plantinga's main project is, from the perspective of the problem of evil, is what he calls a defense. So what is a defense? A defense seeks merely to show that atheists have failed to carry out their case that evil is incompatible with God's existence. In other words, just as I had mentioned earlier on, when it came to the idea of Allah being all-wise, al-Hakim, and so on, what the objective, of a defense is that it's to take the logical argument and show that in fact it doesn't flow. It doesn't, you can't make that logical connection to say if God is all good and He's all powerful, there shouldn't be evil or there shouldn't be God. So defense merely looks at the logical connection there. It's attacking the logical idea. Okay, it is not a theodicy. It's not giving the reasons as to why Allah would permit evil. It's just saying that this particular setup has certain issues with it, and so it tries to unravel those issues and expound upon those issues. All right. So remember when I said that one of the easiest solutions you could have, if you wanted to deal with the logical problem of evil, is to give up one of the attributes, right? That's the easy way of doing it. And from one perspective, the attribute of omnipotence, that Allah is almighty and all powerful, that is where many Christians are able to give some leeway, you can say. Okay. Now, they don't do it in the sense of some sort of total negation that Allah is all powerful and almighty, or the idea that Allah has power over all things. But what they do is they do it under what's known as the free will defense. Okay. Now, how do we understand the free will defense? Okay, and this was something that was, I believe, initiated or at least expounded upon as thoroughly as it can be by Alvin Plantinga himself, and he calls it the free will defense. Right. So, what does the free will defense state? So, what it states is that when it comes to the omnipotence of God, right, the power of God, the ability of God, can we say God can do anything? Now, if you were to ask a typical a Muslim and maybe even a Christian this, the answer would be, of course, yes, God can do anything. Now, from a Christian perspective, or even a Muslim perspective, uh, that statement isn't necessarily not true. Okay. For instance, we know Allah Subhanahu wa Taala says, "Fa'alu lima yurid." Allah does as He wills, whatever He wishes, He does. Right? وَهُوَ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. He is upon all things capable. Okay. But that being said, we ask the question, can God create any world He wants? And this was a conversation and a discussion that happened even within the Islamic theological schools as well. So Imam al-Ghazali speaks about the idea of that God has created the best of all possible worlds. Ibn Taymiyyah speaks about it, and others, and of course Christians speak about it. And what they're trying to say, what is the idea here, is that when you look at the concept of free will, if a human being has free will, they can make choices, then those choices necessitate evil in the world. And that if there was not evil, this would not be the best of all possible worlds. Why? Well, because the best of all possible worlds is one in which human beings have a free choice. And that free choice would be one if it was not if it necessitates that there must be some sort of evil in order for the person to make the choice in the first place. And when it comes to the idea of the best possible world, in this context, you have a number of variables. If God put you in a certain position and gave you X, Y, Z variables and only let you choose one, or only let you say, okay, this is the only choice, that would not be considered free choice. So therefore, the fact that we have a free will, and in fact, Alvin Plantinga himself is someone that subscribes to what's known as libertarian free will. What in the Islamic tradition we may call the Qadariya, right? For those of you who have studied Islamic theology, right? In the sense that human beings have a free will, right? So he's maybe subscribes to, more or less. I don't want to say absolutely, but he's kind of using this free will defense with this in mind, that we have a libertarian free will, that we can choose what we want to do. If that's the case, then you have the best of all possible worlds, meaning there could be no other possibility for God to create a world in which there's a free choice except for this particular world. How so? Because if there was a world in which there was less of a free choice, that would not be the best of all possible worlds, that you would be limited in some way. And so therefore, we have the best of all possible worlds. Now, does this mean that God is limited, that he cannot create other worlds? Well, I mean, he can create other worlds, but this is what William Lane Craig says. And he mentions this, and I think this is kind of hitting home on the point he's trying to make. He says, God's being omnipotent does not imply that he can do logical impossibilities, such as make a round square or make some freely choose to do something. All right. So if you make someone freely choose, that's not them freely choosing. Okay. So now I think that it's important we stop here for a second and understand that even within the Islamic framework, we do not ascribe logical impossibilities to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even though he says he can do whatever he wants. Okay? Now, why do I say that? Is that limiting Allah in some way? In fact, it's not. Because when you think about a logical impossibility, when you have two things that are mutually exclusive, the issue isn't about ability, but it's about words. Okay, what do I mean? Because the words that you're putting forth have a type of meaning. And that those words that you're bringing together, they, when they are mutually exclusive or logically impossible, they have no meaning. If I asked you, please show me someone who is a married bachelor, this has no meaning. Well, can't Allah create a married bachelor? But it doesn't mean anything. This is just semantics. These are words. These are two groups of words that you've smashed together, and you're asking Allah in terms of ability. When the issue isn't ability, it's language, right? So this has to do with language more than it has to do, or no, I shouldn't say more. Um, it has to do with language as opposed to ability. Okay. So from this perspective, Dr. William Lane Craig is correct, right? That when we say that God can do anything, he doesn't do logical impossibilities, right? If you say, can God have a son? Well, we say no, right? And this is one of the issues with the statement that William Lane Craig made, okay? Actually, I'll get to that in a second. Okay, so the point is that this argument would be very powerful with this assumption that God's being is omnipotent does not imply that he can do logical impossibilities. But this becomes an issue of consistency now. In other words, if this is the case that God cannot do logical impossibilities, from a Christian worldview, how does one explain or how does one reconcile the idea that God being omnipotent does not imply that he does logical impossibilities and the impossibility of a being that is both God and human at the same time, that is limited and unlimited at the same time, a being that can hear everything and yet its hearing is limited. Okay, now what I'm referring to here is the idea of Jesus being God from the Christian tradition. Because if God is Jesus, he's, as they say, a God and a man, but then what does that mean? That he is perfect and imperfect at the same time? Does it mean that he knows everything yet lacks knowledge in some things? Does it mean that he was not born ever because he's always existed and yet he was also born? And so on and so on and so on. So, one of the issues with the free will defense, specifically from the Christian perspective, is consistency. How can we take this to be true and yet we're not going to apply this to other areas of theology? Now, I will say this may be an issue with Muslims as well. Now you might think, wait, how is this an issue? Not the idea that, obviously that God became a man or anything like that. But sometimes the issue is placed in the realm of the qadar. You can say the qadar issue, right? The issue of predestination. Okay? Because the idea is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has power over all things. Whatever Allah wills is, and whatever He does not will is not. And yet, we have free will. We can choose things, and we will be judged upon that free will. Now, a Christian may come and say, look, you're saying, just like we're saying, that God's being omnipotent does not imply he can do logical impossibilities. But how do you logically reconcile being free and not free at the same time? That your actions are determined by Allah, and at the same time you are at liberty to do what you like by way of your choice. So no doubt this becomes a logical contradiction from a certain perspective, right? Now, of course, I'm going to take recourse, as we know from our tradition, that this is not something that we are privy to in terms of information. Now, what do I mean by that? Is that even when we look at the Hadith tradition and we look at our sources from the Quran, we understand that we affirm whatever God wills is and whatever Allah does not will is not, and at the same time that He's given us free will. Okay? That being said, as Abu Hanifa said, rahimahullah, that it is the secret of Allah. And in fact, the Prophet ﷺ was even asked about this when he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed some people for the hellfire and some people for paradise. And the companion said, should we stop doing actions? And the Prophet ﷺ said, no, you continue doing the actions. The point is, even if it is not solvable rationally, what you have to ask is is that is there an alternative? And the idea is that there is no alternative. Why? Because no matter what your worldview is, whether you're Christian or Muslim or atheist or agnostic or whatever your worldview is, you still have this issue of determinism versus free will. Okay? And what I mean by that, this becomes what's known as uh, what's known as a trilemma. All right. A trilemma means that you have these three ideas, which only two can be affirmed, and yet you need to accept all three. Okay. So what are these ideas? Number one, that our actions are determined. Right. There are laws by which our actions are determined. So if you're not a theist, you don't believe in God, well, you still have physical laws, right? The laws of physics, the laws of gravity, and so on and so forth. So these laws are determinative. Similarly, you have the laws of all of the functionings of the brain. All of those things that happen, they are subject to certain laws that allow you to think and make choices in a certain way, right? So your actions are determined whether you believe in God or you don't believe in God. At the same time, you understand free will. You make choices. Our entire justice system is based upon people making free choices, having a free will. And yet, no matter what your worldview is, you have to affirm both. You cannot negate one. I mean, you can technically. People have the Qadariyya and the Jabariyya, but the reality is that either via experience or by rational inquiry, you cannot reject both, right? And you have to accept both, no matter what your worldview is. So there is no alternative to this trilemma, except that you accept both and leave it alone. So that's true whether you're a Christian, whether you're a Muslim, whether you're an atheist, whether you're a Hindu, whatever it might be. All right. Does that apply, that very idea that you have to leave it alone because there's no alternative, to the idea of who Jesus was, alayhi salam? And the answer is no, because you have an alternative. And that alternative what is that Jesus was what he said he was, right? He was not God, right? He, as the Muslims say he was a prophet and a messenger sent by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he's not God, right? That is the alternative. So you have a rational alternative to the issue, whereas the case from the issue of qadar, you don't, okay? Now, all of this is to say that if you're going to use this particular idea that God cannot do logical impossibilities, then you have to be consistent. And if not, then your defense is problematic, this free will defense that we're putting forth. All right. So that's one issue. All right. Now, there's another issue that arises. Sorry. And this has to do with, where am I going with this? I think I'm missing a slide here. Uh-oh. Oh, yeah, it looks like I'm missing a slide. Okay. Okay. So here's the question. If when we think about the best of all possible worlds, um, and this idea that God can create any world he wants, and that this is the best of all possible worlds because we have free will in it, well then there's a question. Will we have free will in paradise? Right? I mean, most people would say we would. We would have free will in paradise. Oh, sorry about that. Hey, you guys can still see my screen, right? Just wanted to make sure. Yeah? Just anyone just type, make sure you can see my screen. Yes, okay, perfect. Okay, so what I was saying was, if this is the best of all possible worlds, then how do we explain paradise? Do we not have a free choice in paradise? And what kind of a paradise would it be if we did not have a free choice, right? Okay, so the idea is that when we're talking about the best of all possible worlds, we're talking about moral choices, not a choice about whether you're gonna, eat, what you're gonna have for breakfast, right? Are you gonna have oatmeals? Are you gonna have eggs? That's not necessarily a moral choice. Well, maybe for some of you it might be a moral choice, but generally it's not a moral choice. Are you gonna wear red? Are you gonna wear green? There's no sort of moral choice here. So specifically, this argument related to the free will defense is based on free will where there is a moral choice at stake, then it has to have some sort of moral background to it, right? Some sort of moral force behind it. Okay, so so if that's the case, when we look at this from a Christian worldview point of view, what is the moral significance of making moral choices? What is the value of making moral choices? And why I'm presenting that is because one of the theological, you can say, beliefs, one of the beliefs that the Christians have is that once you accept the death and resurrection of Jesus, uh, then you are guaranteed paradise. Okay, why? Because that historical event, that event that took place according to them, that event that took place has resolved all of the sins. And so all the sins have been compensated, past, present, and future. Okay? But in order to have that, you must accept that Jesus died for your sins. Now, if that's the case, and we now and let's say someone now accepts that, they believe that, they have this belief in their heart, whatever it might be, they've accepted it totally. Now, when they move forward through their life and they have to make a moral choice, what is the value of that moral choice if paradise is already guaranteed? And I hope everyone understands like why I'm mentioning this, right? Because the entire argument is built on the fact that it's a moral choice. But the moral choice has to have some sort of a value. If it has no value, whether after you accept Jesus in your life and then you go and you fornicate and then you murder someone or whatever it is and you still enter paradise, or you do righteous actions day in and day out and you fast and you pray and whatever it might be and you're giving charity, that it doesn't matter as long as you have the belief. What's the point of the moral choice? How does that have any sort of significance or any sort of impact on you moving forward? And so, one of the one of the dialogues we did, the Christian person, the Christian, the person I was speaking with, they came and they asked, and this was in a Q&A, you can say, like what we call a crossfire, not in an abrasive way, but yani they asked, they said, look, in Christianity we are guaranteed paradise. Are you guaranteed paradise? Right? And I thought it was interesting because sometimes a lot of missionaries will use this to say, look, we have a guarantee of paradise. And at the time, alhamdulillah, what came to my mind was this ayah, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قُلْ إن كانت لكم الدار الآخرة عند الله خالصة من دون الناس. If, say, O Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, say, if the home of the hereafter is with Allah, is for you alone, right? عند الله خالصة من دون الناس, is for you only, right? فَتَمَنَّأُ الْمَوْتِ, so wish for death, in kuntum sadiqin, if you are speaking the truth, if you're truthful. If you're truthful on this claim, right, that has penetrated the depths of your heart, that you know for a fact, then why would you not wish for death, right? And this may seem a bit harsh, by the way, but when you think about it, it's kind of the logical conclusion of someone being guaranteed paradise, right? You ask the question, why would I go through life with all of its vicissitudes, with all of the ups and downs? I get a flat tire, I have an argument with my wife, my kids are not listening to me, my maybe my brother dies, whatever, all of these hardships and problems and evils, when on the other side, what you have is bliss, is paradise. Why go through all that? Because no matter what, you're still going there anyways. So why stay alive? What is the moral value of staying alive, right? From that perspective, it doesn't make sense. Um, anyway, he didn't really have much of a response, just to let you guys know. But anyway. So my point is that when we look at this idea of the free will defense, it has another issue aside from consistency, and that has to do with the idea of what is the moral value of actions. Because if Jesus has died for the sins that past, present, and future, and we consider suicide a sin, then that's not a problem either, right? And you can extend this even further. Like, is not accepting Jesus as your Lord and Savior a sin? And so he only died for certain sins and not other sins, and so on and so forth. So it can go much further, but I'm saying, at least from a Christian worldview, someone who adopts Christianity, who is a Christian, they really have to take this seriously and say, hold on, but this has to do with moral choices. And if the choice has no value, then what makes it moral? Like, if I choose A or B, then what's the value of that choice? All right. So up to this point, we've been comparing worldviews, okay? And like I said, this is where we started from, and we've spoken a little bit about the nature of God, both from an Islamic point of view and a Christian point of view. We've spoken about salvation, okay? So that's kind of where we are at this point. And we spoke about the idea of about God being omnipotent. Now let's move on to the idea of God being omnibenevolent. Okay, so when it came to omnipotence, the argument that the Christian is bringing forth is that we don't say that God can create any world he wants, right? That's free of evil because of the free will defense. So that's how they're knocking the idea of omnipotence. The idea of omniscient, that's just kind of accepted across the board. They're not really messing with that. The two primary attributes they're focusing on is the omnipotence, and now we're going to talk about the omnibenevolence, all that God is all loving. All right. Okay. If you see some of the works of Dr. William Lane Craig and others, they have a claim they make. And the claim they make, they say the God of Islam is deficient. So if you go on, you look at some of the debates that William Lane Craig has done with some Muslim apologists and things like that, they say, okay, the God of Islam is deficient. Now, why is the God of Islam deficient? He says, well, because when we think about God, we consider God the greatest conceivable being. And that if we consider God to be the greatest conceivable being, we consider that if is the greatest conceivable being would be loving rather than not loving. Okay. Now it seems like a pretty straightforward argument. However, he said in his debates before, William Lane Craig, he goes, what we find in the Quran is that God does not love some people. And then he quotes some ayat. So for instance, I have here on the screen, God does not love any ungrateful sinner. God does not love those who spread corruption. Verily, God does not love the transgressors. God does not love the oppressors, and so on and so forth. Now, of course, he didn't really mention the people that God does love, but from this perspective, what we have to then ask is this a deficiency in God, in our conception of God, or is there something else going on? Okay. So, wait a minute. Okay. So now there's a certain issue that arises when the conception of God is such. Okay. In other words, part of what Dr. William Lane Craig said in that debate was that we in Christianity believe God is unconditionally loving, right? That it's just God is all loving. He is, unconditionally loving. There's no conditions. It's not that if you disobey God, you'll be removed from God's love. Okay. Now, one of the issues with that particular statement is that if he's unconditionally loving, and yet the people that don't believe in the death and resurrection of Jesus will go to hell, then that is a condition for God's love. But anyway, that's not what I'm trying to point at. What I'm trying to point at here is the idea that this view of God is like someone that views God as an all or none principle. Okay, kind of like how neurons work. They use a charge, it's either all or none, right? Or like a monolithic block. Either God loves you or does not love you. There is no idea or there's no concept from this worldview of gradations. In other words, that God can love some people more than some people, right? That doesn't mean God does not love those people. It's just there is a gradation here, that God can love some more than others. That entire concept is out the window, okay? Now, he mentioned this thing called perfect being theology. Okay, in the sense that, and I'll read here what T.J. Mosen says. He says, according to perfect being theology, we should be guided in our thinking about the divine attributes by the thought that God, were he to exist, would have to be the most perfect conceivable being. Okay, now this is from the idea of how do we understand what are the names and attributes of God devoid of revelation. Okay, and I want to stress that. And this is where we're going to come when we talk about the Islamic idea of who Allah is. We see that it is tied intensely with revelation. Okay, so when we talk about God being all loving, all right, then we can start to assume about God certain things because based on our limited human experience. So when we talk about God and God's love, for instance, Paul S. Fides says, with many other theologians today, I judge that a God of love must participate in the risk that creating beings I should say created, that created beings endure. Only if God suffers in God's own self is it credible to trace suffering to the free will of creation. In other words, the only way that God can truly be loving is that God himself suffers. All right. So if we're now kind of left to our own devices, what does it mean for God to be all loving, unconditionally loving? That it's either he's loving or he's not loving, and there's no gradations, then you can start making claims like this that, well, if God is truly loving and he's all loving, then he must suffer. Why? Because our conception as God as the greatest conceivable being is one who suffers, and that's how you know that the person is loving, right? Because they have this idea that God suffers in his own self. Because how is God otherwise going to know what his creation is suffering, right? And again, it goes to this idea of how exactly do we understand God's love? Anyhow, so from that perspective, we have to ask the question, if God is all loving, without gradations, unconditionally loving, then when it comes to the emotive side, the emotional problem of evil, this exacerbates it. Okay, meaning if God is all loving, then really a person's going to now struggle with a concept of evil in their life or a concept of suffering. That, oh God, if you love me so much and there's no conditions, yeah, I've done so many things, but I believe in you and you love me so, but I'm still suffering through cancer. I'm still, I still have this issue and that issue and so on and so forth, right? It exacerbates the issue when you take this all or none approach or unconditionally loving approach from an emotive standpoint, okay? Now, from the Islamic standpoint, we say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when he speaks about his love, that first of all, we understand who Allah is, his names and attributes, that they are maximally perfect with no deficiency in his other names and attributes. And so Allah is not just all loving, and he's not just all powerful. In fact, the terms all loving, all powerful, these are English equivalencies, right? He's al-Qadir, he is al-Wudud. But the alif lam in the Arabic language doesn't necessarily mean an absoluteness. And what I mean by that is when we think about who Allah is, we say he's maximally perfect such that there's no deficiency in his other names and attributes. So if he is maximally perfect in his love, he is also, without any contradiction, maximally perfect in his justice. He's maximally perfect, subhanahu wa ta'ala, in his wisdom. He's al-Hakim, and so on. He's as-Sabur, as-Shakur, and so on, as we know. Okay? If you're going to say that it's an all or none, that God is unconditionally loving, and that God either loves or does not love, as as it was stated, then this is something where we have to ask about the justice of God and how we understand the justice of God. Is God just? And in fact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even mentions this. He says, أَفَنَجْعَلُ الْمُسْلِمِينَ كَالْمُجْرِمِينَ? Are we going to now treat the Muslims, those people that have submitted, who are righteous, who are pious, who are worshiping Allah, are we going to treat those people like we treat criminals? Malakum, kayfa tahkumun? What's the matter with you? Is this a proper judgment? When you make that idea, God is either loving or not loving, unconditionally loving, what we're saying is that both Fir'aun, right, and Musa are in the same category. Hitler and Aaron, let's say the prophet Aaron or the prophet Abraham, are in the same category, right? Because God's love is unconditional. There's no gradations, and this is incorrect, and it stems from this very concept about not understanding who Allah is. And one of the blessings that the Muslims have is that we have an understanding about who Allah is, because we, and this is the second point, we describe Allah as He describes Himself. And this becomes very important. And this was something that Imam Ahmad, for instance, said when he was being tortured for his belief and his standing firm that the Quran indeed is the uncreated word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, so um, so if that's the case, we describe Allah as He describes Himself, it means that we're using revelation to understand who Allah is, not just using our own logical devices and this and that. We don't have that limitation. Whereas from a perfect being theology point of view, those limitations arise. Okay. Now, just speaking about gradations, Allah's love being, that there are levels of Allah's love. For instance, we have this hadith, Abu Hurairah radiallahu anh, comes from Sahih Muslim. The Prophet ﷺ said that the strong believer is more beloved to Allah than the weak believer. They're both, but there's goodness in both of them, but they're both good. So clearly, here the Prophet ﷺ is telling us that Allah prefers the strong believer over the weak believer. And at the same time, he says that, but in both of them is good. It's not that he doesn't love one, or he doesn't like one, or one he's cast aside or something. They're both good. But there's a preference here. There's a level here, right? Al-Mu'min al-Qawi, that this strong believer is better and more beloved than the weak believer, right? وَبِكُلِّ خَيْرٍ. And then both of them is khair, is good. Now, what's really fascinating is that it doesn't just stop there, because then the Prophet ﷺ then tells us how do we move, that if we are in the state of being a weak believer, how do we move to being a strong believer? احرص على ما ينفعك واستعن بالله ولا تعجز. So how do you do that? You strive, you be eager, you go for what benefits you. You seek the help of Allah, and you never consider yourself incapable, right? So not only is it that there's a statement here that's giving us information about these gradations, but then how do you move from being in the state of weakness to a state of strength? Okay, so my point in mentioning that is the idea of gradation in Allah's love, and not extracting a few of the names and attributes of God, then interpret them how we want, and then assuming and then making assumptions based upon that, because that leads to an emotive problem when it comes to the problem of evil. All right, so we've spoken about the logical side, right? The intellectual side. I wanted to now kind of, as we're going to be wrapping up in a few minutes, in a little bit, inshallah, move on to the emotional problem of evil. So far, what we've done is we've shown that Christianity has certain issues in dealing even with the logical problem of evil. Okay? We've looked at how Islam is not subject to those limitations or those issues when dealing with the logical problem of evil. But now we want to look at the very real human side. And that probably has to do more with the idea of the theodicy that Alvin Plantinga mentions, and that is the reasons why God would allow, or perhaps we can say from our conceptual framework, the wisdoms behind why Allah would allow evil. Now, let me just preface this discussion by saying that I'm not claiming we know all the wisdoms. That's not what I'm claiming. In fact, nobody can say that, right? Nobody can say they know all the wisdoms of Allah, because then they would be claiming knowledge to the same level as Allah. So obviously we know that's not true. But what we are saying is, when someone honestly, without any sort of biases, looks at the Islamic tradition, they will find that the reasons and the wisdoms that have been given, that there are a plethora of them, that there are so many that it's difficult to even count. However, those emotional wisdoms, or sorry, those wisdoms that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given, are intrinsically tied to existential questions, right? So what do I mean by existential questions? What I mean by that is questions about How did we get here? Who we are, like, or like, what is our purpose? Excuse me. And what is the where are we going, right? So if you guys, I don't know if Imran Hussein covered this, but he gives a very interesting example of people. Like, imagine if we did a thought experiment that you're now listening to this, and all of a sudden you black out, and all of a sudden when you wake up, you're on a plane, and this isn't just you're not sitting in any plane, but you're in first class, and you're in first class. The seats are very comfortable. The plane ride, it's very smooth. You look out the window, there's a beautiful kind of sunset-ish hue, that orangish. It's just very pleasing to the eyes. Yeah. And then of course the temperature is perfect as well. One of the things about here in Texas is that we're always fighting over the air conditioning. But anyhow, on this plane, the temperature is perfect. And and after a little while, you smell something. And sure enough, it's the person who's bringing you your favorite food. So whatever your favorite food is, just imagine that now, right? Biryani, steak, whatever it is, okay? And you put it in your mouth, and oh, it just melts in your mouth. It tastes amazing. All right. Now you're on this plane, so the question that comes about is, would you be happy? Now you may be happy with all of the delights, but you were sitting in front of the computer screen or wherever you're listening to this. You blacked out, and now you're on this plane. You would have certain questions that would be bugging you to death. How did I get here? What am I doing here? What's my purpose? Why am I here? And maybe the most important question, where is the plane going? Right? Where is this journey taking me? So when we talk about existential questions, we're talking about questions about our existence that are much like being on like this metaphorical plane of life. You come to a certain state of consciousness, these questions become very important. How did I get here? What's my purpose? And where is this plane going? Where is this metaphorical plane going? From that perspective, if we understand the Islamic reasons and Islamic answers to those questions, then the problem of evil from an emotional standpoint, because those answers are based in truth, because we said that Islam is true, we were talking about worldviews, remember, that therefore to navigate suffering and evil in the world becomes much easier. Okay, whereas from a Christian perspective, those same tools are not available. Okay, they may be to some extent, because when we talk about purpose of life and things like that, there is some overlap. Okay, but what's really interesting is that when those reasons related to, let's say, purpose of life, existence, and etc., when they come from the Christian sources, uh, there is a certain guesswork that goes on, in the sense that, and this is Alvin Plantinga, in this YouTube video, you can check it out. He says something to the effect of, there are no good reasons presented except through guesswork that God allows suffering. So remember, he was talking about the difference between a defense and a theodicy. So the defense is just unraveling the logic. But he's saying when it comes to theodicy, reasons, yeah, we can understand some maybe through guesswork. The reality of the Islamic framework is that we're not limited to guesswork. We have very clear revelation that kind of gives us some of those wisdoms, and in fact, many of them. All right. Okay, so let's just quickly look over this a second. When we talk about what is our purpose, and this is, I'm sure for many of you, this is like, okay, I already know my purpose. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. We did not create the human beings and jinn except for my worship. So we know that our purpose is to worship Allah. However, when you're speaking to someone who, let's say, is not Muslim, these may not be that clear, right? For instance, when we say worship, what does worship mean? Ibn al-Qayyim mentions that worship is the highest level of love coupled with the highest level of submission, right? So it's ghayatul muhabba, it is the highest level of love with the epitome of submission, because when it could be a state that you love someone, but that you don't submit to them. So you may love your children, but you don't submit to your children, right? Similarly, you could be in a state where you submit to someone, but you don't necessarily love them. You could have a tyrannical ruler, and this is a person that you're forced to submit to. and yet you don't love this person. It's only when you couple love and submission that you would call that ubudiyah, that you would call that worship. Okay? Now it comes down to, like, we worship Allah. So why do we submit and love Allah? Well, number one, because of who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. And so now it goes back to understanding who He is. Remember, we were talking about the discussion on names and attributes, who Allah is, and a lot of that can be ascertained from revelation, and a lot of that has to do with what the revelation is pointing you towards, the marvel in creation, right? Being in a state of awe, etc. So you marvel at the creative ability of Allah, and because of who Allah is, He is worthy of worship, and worship as we defined it, right? Like, I'll give you another example, and I have it here in brackets. For those of you who are basketball fans, if you've ever seen like Steph Curry hit a jump shot, it'll be sometimes he'll be jumping, and the ball leaves his hand, and it's almost like there's silence, and then it goes through the net. There's no rim; it just flows through. Now, you would stand up like, wow, that's amazing. You're like you're in awe basically of his ability and the ability to do that. Now, you're in awe of that ability. How much more so when it comes to the creator of the heavens and the earth, right? That ability that gave you life, that ability, and the one that will bring you death, right? So we love Allah because of who He is, right? And number two, we love Allah because of the blessings that He gives, which should lead to gratitude. All right? We submit to Allah because He's all knowing, right? He is Al Alim, Al Hakim, and so on. And we understand that in this submission, our purpose in life, if it is to worship Allah, then that worship based on the idea of submission will be a type of test. And in being a test, there has to be things that are negative that we'll be facing, right? If indeed this life is a test, and so and we see this a lot when we're looking at the when we're looking at the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُم مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. That when a disaster strikes them, right, they are then brought back to Allah, saying, indeed, we belong to Allah, and indeed to Him we will return. So the idea is sometimes Allah will put you in a certain situation of suffering in order to remind you of your deeper purpose, right? And that's why, Nietzsche said, he goes, he who has a why can bear any how. If you understand your purpose, then if you have a why, you have a reason for your existence, you understand why you're on this metaphorical plane, then the how, whatever that entails, it's bearable. You can do it. You can go through it. Okay. The second, and by the way, there's many. I'm not gonna even try to cover all of them. But the second thing we need to understand related to the existential questions. When I said many, I meant the wisdoms, not the questions, right? The second has to do with the nature of this world, right? And by extension, the nature of the afterlife. When we understand that this world is a test and that there is a certain nature of the world itself, a dunya, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions, He says, اعلموا أنما الحياة الدنيا لعب ولهو وزينة وتفاخر بينكم وتكاثر في أموال والأولاد. That know that the life of this world is but amusement and diversion and adornment and boasting to one another and competition in increase of wealth and children. Now, what's interesting is the word dunya. It comes from this idea of being lowly, something that does not have a lot of worth. It's something lowly. So if there's hayat dunya, if there's a life of this world, there has to be a hayatul ulya. There has to be a higher life, which is the afterlife. So in terms of what is the nature of this world, we understand that the world itself is not valuable. But what's valuable is the actual purpose and journey that we're on in this world. As Sheikh Sha'rawi said, he says, "Ad-dunya mazra'atul akhirah," that this dunya is a seed bed for the hereafter. What you plant here is what's important, not the thing itself, right? Not the actual dunya itself, right? And this is a perspective that is somewhat different in the Christian framework. Why? Because from the Christian framework, God loves the world. From the Muslim framework, as the Prophet ﷺ told us, that if Allah had any sort of value of this world, he would not give the ingrate even a sip of water to drink, right? And here I'm translating kafir as ingrate. You can say unbeliever, however you want to translate it. But we understand that the value of the dunya itself in the eyes of Allah is not, it itself is not valuable. Rather, our actions within it are valuable. From the Christian perspective, you have the Bible that says, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. So this world has an immense amount of value from that perspective. And if that's the case, evil has a lot more value from that perspective as well. All right. The second thing we have to understand is that the nature of this world, it's not paradise and it's not hellfire. Paradise is pure bliss. Hellfire is pure suffering. And we are in this state where we have samples of both, right? We don't know exactly what paradise is like, but similarly, we don't know exactly what hellfire is like. Yet, because of this mix, it is a means by which we come back to Allah, where we worship Allah, and we have a motivation to do that. We understand pleasure, we understand pain. This is something that's fundamental to every human being. No human being will do something that goes against pleasure or that increases pain. They're going to try to decrease pain. Now, what I mean by that, I don't mean that just in terms of some sort of sensual pleasure. I mean that if in a person's intellect they don't see something as beneficial, they will never do it. Even someone that steals something, there may be a moral issue with this, but for them, they see the thing that they're getting having a certain type of pleasure. And that's why they go and steal, right? And so the idea is that the human being is based on or constructed with this concept of pain and pleasure, right? And of course, we know like liberalism has this ingrained within it, the idea of pain and pleasure, and how do certain political philosophies and things like that are built upon this concept. But it doesn't make the concept wrong. And so this world, it gives us an idea of pleasure. Allah puts you in a situation where things are going easy and you understand pleasure. And Allah puts you in a situation where things can be going difficult and you understand pain. You understand paradise from a certain perspective and the hellfire. Why? In order to encourage you to fulfill your very purpose. And that is to worship Allah alone, right? And so, when we think about paradise, what is paradise? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Kahf, مَاكِثِينَ فِيهِ أَبَدًا, that they will be in paradise, makith. When this term, they'll be in paradise forever in the state of makith. What is makith? This idea that when you engage with something and you derive pleasure from it, that instead of the pleasure decreasing, that it in fact increases. So when like when you're really, really thirsty, or you really want pizza or whatever it might be, you'll get the pizza. The cheese is oozing off. I want you guys to picture this, right? It's the cheese oozing off. It's fresh. It's hot, and then you eat it. So you have one slice, and then another, and then another, and then another. Now, there's going to come a certain point where to put it in modern terms, your utility will go down. Meaning you didn't enjoy the first slice. You didn't enjoy the last slice like you enjoyed the first slice, right? So that initial pleasure that you had, right? Maybe even the excitement about eating it was part of that pleasure, that diminishes. When it comes to paradise, when a person is makith, what this term refers to is that initial excitement that you have to engage with whatever that particular thing is doesn't go down as you do it more. It in fact increases every single time you do it. مَاكِثِينَ فِيهِ أَبَدًا. Imam al-Ghazali, he mentioned something, and hopefully there's no like kids on this particular webinar, but he says that if you want to have an idea of what paradise, some sort of semblance of what paradise could possibly be like in some very limited way, he goes, think about like a sexual climax. If you understand that, you understand uh, some semblance of what paradise is. So the nature of this world, coming back to the point, it's not pure bliss, even though we have some things that point in that direction, and it's not pure pain, but it's a mix. And that has the wisdom of pushing the person forward in terms of their very purpose. All right? So anyways, There's a lot more that could be said in terms of the wisdoms of Allah when we talk about life being a test, etc. We could talk about the suffering of that suffering of the innocent is not temporary. There's other wisdoms and so on. But I'm going to stop here, and we'll open up for any questions that anyone might have um, before we conclude for the day. So if you have questions, please go ahead and post them, inshallah. I'll try to get to them. All right. Yeah, I'm sure. So someone said, let's see. How do you explain if someone, Christian, suggests that they're here to preach the message that Jesus died to save our sins to increase more people in heaven? They could think like that, right? Could you please justify this? May Allah bless you. Okay. So again, remember when I was making the point about what is the moral force of that? Okay. So if we consider that morally good, that okay, it's good to have more people uh you know become Christian, right? Because that in essence will lead more people to paradise. Okay, now that's a great, the fact that you want more people to go to paradise, that's wonderful. Okay, and maybe you gain some pleasure from that. Okay, but if the question has to do with suffering, then what's the value of that for you as an individual? Meaning, like, let's say you bring in 10 people or you bring in 5,000 people, your destination is still paradise. And in the process of bringing in 10 people, you you know you have flat tires and so on and so forth. In the process of bringing 5,000 people, you lose 2 children and you have that immense pain that one of them had cancer. Now, in the end, whether you bring in 10 or 1,000, you're still going to paradise. So what is it that would keep you from, why would you do it? Like, from you as an individual point of view, like, why would you care to continue on? Just out of some moral goodness that a person has? But then even that moral goodness, what is the motivating factor for that moral goodness? And so I think that especially from the idea of the problem of evil, it just, there needs to be some sort of a moral force. So someone said, who is Allah is to think in Ayatul Kursi. When we talk about Allah's names and attributes to people and they agree, what would be the next step? I know that keeping in touch is important. So now we're talking specifically from a dawah perspective. Yeah, so you want to move from the idea of who Allah is to the fact that Allah deserves to be worshipped, right? And if that's the case, that as we define worship, then from that point you want to ask them, okay, well, if that's something you agree with, then would you testify to that, right? Now, obviously, I've oversimplified it. I'm sure there's a lot of other questions about other things, but that's the core message, right, of Tawheed, who Allah is and the fact that Allah is worthy of worship. I think Hamza gave this example. I'm assuming the one of the plane. So yes, I totally stole that from him. Thanks for sharing. It was insightful to learn about Islam. However, I'm not sure that the Christian beliefs were correctly represented in their critiques. Reach out to you on Twitter. Okay, fair enough. I look forward to that. How does constantly stop thinking about qadr? Or how does one stop thinking about qadr? Well, I mean, from the perspective of, what are you going to be held accountable for, right? You're not going to be held accountable for whether you understand qadr as it's supposed to be, because frankly, it's one of those things that should bring us back to understand that Allah knows and the human being is limited, right? وَمَا أُوتِيتُم مِنَ الْعِلْمِ إِلَّا قَلِيلًا. We've only given you but a small fraction of knowledge. We've only given you a little bit of knowledge. And so there are some things that we are just not going to know by the fact that we are human beings, right? Our intellects, just like every other tool that we've been blessed with, has limits, right? No one says that their eyesight can see everything, or you can see past the wall, you can see into another room, right? It's just your eyesight has limitations. Like, I can't see you, the person that's asking a question right now, right? And maybe you're in a different country altogether. So I understand my eyesight has limitations. My hearing has limitations. I can't hear what's going on down the street, for instance. Just like that, our intellect also has limitations. And when we understand that we're going to have limitations, we're encouraged to use our intellect, but at the same time, there are some things that we submit onto Allah. And we say submit, that is Islam. Al-Islam wal-Istislam, right? Islam is submission. So those things that we can rationally understand, well and good. If not, then we leave it alone and we say Allah knows best, and we continue to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah knows best. All right. Let's see. So thank you. Someone said once said to me, we work towards Jannah when our negative feelings would be removed, and this life is worth living. Well, the focus isn't this life. So I hope I kind of mentioned that. What is meant by the Quran? The word of Allah is uncreated. I mean, it's the world of Allah. So isn't it? So I said word and not world. So obviously the world is created. The word of Allah, here we're talking about the Quran, Allah's speech is uncreated, if I've understood the question correctly. How Christians can morally believe that evil and righteous people can be in the same category? Yes, that is a problem. Okay. If God knows where you're going to end up, why does he have to create you and test you? How can I answer this? Please explain once more. Okay. Just because Allah knows, and this is actually a different question, just because Allah knows where you're going to end up, um, it doesn't mean that you don't have a responsibility, right? Again, you want to look at it from the perspective of you as an individual, okay? Why does he have to create you and test you? That's not like why is that an important question? Let's put it that way, right? For you as an individual, if you say, why did Allah create me? Okay, but that's making a baseline assumption that you have the right because of who you are, right? But it's Allah's choice, right? He is the creator, Al Khaliq, Al Malik, and so on and so forth. This idea that I have, like, I own myself, this is, I know I talked about libertarian free will, but under libertarianism, that under libertarianism, this is the idea, and this is taken as a philosophy, right? I own myself, therefore the government can't tell me what to do. No one can tell me what to do. Seatbelt laws should be outlawed. I shouldn't pay taxes because that's a type of slavery. But that assumption, I think the assumption is the problem, right? Why does he have to create you and test you? Well, why do you have a right to even ask that question? Like, why? Like, if you own yourself, you've done something to, to create yourself or bring yourself from a state of non-existence to a state of existence, and have the right to that question. That's separate. But in addition to that, when you're saying, like, why does he have to create you and test you? In fact, that is a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? That he created you, gave you life, and gave you the opportunity to worship him, right? So you can look at it from that perspective as well. And Allah knows best. All right, a lot of qadr questions. Okay, can we say qadr is Allah knowing what you do but not forcing you to make decisions? Aren't they separate things? Well, remember, again, this is not something that you can actually solve, because are we saying that that your decisions are outside the control of Allah, that Allah's control is limited? That might be that might be a problem, right? But then are we saying that we have no decisions that we can make? That would also be a problem, right? So you have to just basically leave it alone and ask for an alternative. If there's an alternative, Bismillah, let's see it. What is the alternative, right? Okay, Allah has created the conditions in which our choices and reactions to the events that happen to us. Okay, Jazakallah khair. How do we counter someone raising a point? If Allah is all loving, then why is there hell and punishment? Well, remember, we didn't say that Allah is all loving. This absolute idea of all loving is problematic. We said that Allah is maximally perfect in his attribute of loving, such that his other attributes, there's no deficiency. So while he is maximally perfect in his love, he's also maximally perfect in his justice. And that's where you have to basically leave it, inshallah. All right. Okay, so how can you justify little children getting killed as a matter of a test? Keep in mind that that's not the only reason that is there. Remember, I said there are some wisdoms that we know and some that we don't. But just because we don't know the wisdom doesn't necessitate that God doesn't exist, right? So it's just a matter of saying, I don't know the wisdom, therefore there must not be one. But you can't, that's a logical leap, right? Just because we don't know the wisdom doesn't mean there isn't one. So really, the point is, can we say that Allah is all wise, or sorry, maximally perfect in his wisdom? Is he al-Hakim? And if he is, some things we'll know the wisdom, some things we may not, right? In this case, how can little children getting killed as a matter of a test? It might not be a test. It may be that, in fact, it may be the idea that it's a test for the people that are still living. Like, what will be your reaction? That may be one way of looking at it, right? The idea of what is the end of those children? Like, will they end up in paradise, in eternal bliss? Well, then, in fact, them dying is better for them, and so on. But again, just because you don't know the wisdom behind something, even though we have many in our tradition related to those existential questions, doesn't necessitate that there isn't a wisdom behind it. Okay, little child. So again, that's the test question. How can we, all right, okay. How can we also counter liberal ideology of the fact that we are bound by rules and regulations of the religion, whereas let's say atheists are free of all shackles? So from the perspective of the idea of free of all shackles, I mean, they're not free of like physical laws. And so I don't know if this question is referring to the idea of determinism versus free will, or it's talking about something else. But from that perspective, you can't say that you can't really argue that the physical laws don't have any sort of impact on them. If an atheist does say that, it's not a true statement, right? But in the sense of liberal ideology, bound by rules and regulations of religion, whereas let's say atheists are free of all shackles. Yeah, I mean, even if that's the case, if we look at it from an ideological point of view, yeah, I mean, look, everyone has something that they're worshiping, right? They submit to something. That something could be themselves. And from that perspective, they look at that as freedom. But really, we say that Allah is Al-Alim. He is Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. He's the most merciful, the most, whatever mercy we perceive, Allah's more merciful than that, right? If a mother has mercy on her child, Allah's more merciful than that. You know, Allah, whatever we know, Allah knows more than that. So if the submission to that being that knows that much, has that much mercy, if that isn't freeing you from the limitations of yourself, then really you've got the definitions mixed up, right? Allah knows best. Something I know is struggling with their iman because they're upset that the disbelievers will. Okay. Also question why. Yeah, so remember, so the question says that someone's struggling with the iman because of the idea of the hellfire and someone being in the hellfire forever. Look, remember, we have to understand we're not going to understand the wisdoms to everything. Even the hellfire, I'm going to say, has a wisdom. Even the permanence, let's say, of the hellfire has a wisdom behind it. Just because we don't know the wisdom doesn't mean that Allah is not wise or that it has no purpose behind it, right? Allah does not do things without purpose. And so when we say that Allah is al-adl, that He is maximally perfect in His justice, that is something you'll have to wait and actually see, right? On the day of judgment, and I believe this in Surah Al-Zumar, when the people will be taken to paradise, they will say, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. And we know that the people taken to the hellfire will also say, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Why? Because the people of paradise will understand the mercy of Allah and they'll see the perfection of that mercy, right? The people of going to the hellfire will see the perfection of Allah's justice, right? But that's on the day of judgment when the books have been cleared and everything is now settled, right? Just because we don't see it here doesn't mean that there's no wisdom behind it. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. All right. So I think I'm going to go ahead and stop there because we've just got a lot more questions coming in. Let's see. Let me actually just see if I can scroll through some of these. Some of these are okay. Some of these are just comments, which is okay. How many? All right. Again, I think we've answered some of these. Okay. So I think I've covered them. So that being said, Jazakumullah khair. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of you for attending. If there was some beneficial information that'll help you, your own personal iman, your own personal struggles, or someone you may know, or help you in your dawah, all of that is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If there are any mistakes, or maybe some assumptions that I made that I shouldn't have, and things like that, that's all 100% from me. And if you notice anything like that, please reach out to me and let me know that, hey, you mentioned this, but that wasn't, I didn't really see it that way. I know we had a gentleman who was here, hopefully still here, and he said he's going to reach out to me. So please do. Love to connect and maybe speak further about some of these issues. So with that said, may Allah bless all of you, and may He accept the best of your deeds, and may He allow all of us to meet again in Jannat al-Firdaus. Jazakum al khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.